Hello and welcome to the Church World Service webinar series, Caring in Crisis, the Leader Briefs. I'm your host, Reverend Mary Hughes with Crisis Care Ministries, and we're so glad that you've joined us today. This is our fourth week of the 6-week series, and we've been having a wonderful time together, hearing from specialists in crisis response, mental health, family and congregational life. And today, you and I, all of us, are so very blessed to hear from the Rabbi Vered Harris. I'll introduce her in just a moment as she talks about taking the long view with faith. But first, of course, a few housekeeping reminders. As the introductory slide rotation indicates, you can find all things webinar, details about the schedule, details about our presenters, their bios, resources that they have provided, as well as a link to the video recordings after the fact. Just click on the webinar page, the webinar hub at the top of the page that you see on your screen right now. It is updated regularly, so you may need to refresh your page. Throughout the webinar today, please feel free to type questions in the question box, questions and comments. That's the question box, not the chat box, and we hope to be able to address those questions toward the end of our hour. After the webinar, watch your inboxes for links to the webinar recordings and a link to the session evaluation. And if you requested an attendance certificate, you'll be receiving that by email as well. If you have any questions, contact Heather Wilson, and Heather is managing the attendance certificates. She can put her email address in the question box as well. And now, it is my great honor to introduce to you today's presenter. Rabbi Vered Harris became the spiritual leader of Temple B'nai Israel in Oklahoma City in 2012. She is the 5th rabbi to serve the congregation since its founding in 1903. Rabbi Harris's community work in Oklahoma City includes interfaith dialogue, guest lecturing, and multi-faith prayer services. At the temple, she enjoys serving with a professional and volunteer team, offering religious education, pastoral care, prayer, and social action opportunities. Although she was born Jewish, her formal study of the religion did not begin until college. Through learning and living Judaism, Rabbi Harris has become more passionate about civil rights, more compassionate for those who suffer, more open to universal truth, and more open to being an overall better human. And she certainly is. So welcome, Rabbi Harris.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for inviting me today. And thank you to Heather Wilson as well for all the behind the scenes tech support, for everything that you've been doing. And really thanks to the good people of World Church Service and the work that you are doing, Church World Service. All the work that you're doing to bring hope and healing to the world is inspiring. I'm going to share my screen and put up some slides that hopefully will be a little bit more interesting than just staring at my face as I share. And thank you all for joining today and taking some of your sacred time to maybe think about things in a way that might be a little bit different. My idea for this talk stems from the belief that in looking back at history, at the traumas that human beings inflict as well as survive, that this can remind us that in any given moment, in this moment, the difficulties that we face are, in a sense, going to be okay. In any given moment, history is unfolding and we don't know where it's going, but looking at where we have been can give us perspective for where we are. So I'd like to suggest that the Jewish people have known trauma and we have chosen resilience. This means that we have been creative, adaptive, and our strength today is really built on our survival of yesterday. Many peoples, of course, have known trauma collectively and individually, and this is meant to be then just one perspective, one framing of the hope that can arise from struggle. We're in a series of communal traumas today, including but not limited to war, refugees seeking safe shelter, global climate change, the pandemic, its politicization, racial injustice in our nation, a rise in anti-Semitism, deep reckonings that are necessary to create a more just world. Sadly, we know too well that individuals perish in times of communal trauma. We also lose predictable ways of life. Traumas are not equivocal. We cannot compare or rank individual experiences such as rape or bankruptcy or illness or being robbed or abandoned or deceived. But still, whether it is individual or communal, and without comparing, I think that if we were to ask those who are experiencing trauma, with this magic wand, you can make it all stop right now, or let it play out. And if you let it play out, you're going to see new, creative, resilient world yet to be emerge. So what do you choose? Make it stop right now, or look and see what will be? I believe that most of us would say, just make it stop. The allure of what might come out of trauma is not nearly as great as the desire to make trauma stop, but going back is not one of our choices. So our choices lie really only in what we do next. So to take the long view, let's go way back to a sunrise over a world before any of us were around, the dawning of creation, seen from a distance, the world at peace. There is a kind of expansive general hope, quiet, a distant peace when you can't see people and what we do on the earth. From my perspective, religion and peoplehoods and nationalities are all for the sake of human beings. We've not always used them for the benefit of humanity, unless we consider that learning resilience is a benefit. So we're going to take a few moments of history and think about resilience and adaptation as hallmarks of the Jewish people. They are fundamental to my personal development of faith, and I'd like to show you what I mean. About half of the world's Jewish population lives today in the Great Jewish Diaspora. This diaspora began approximately 2,600 years ago, when the Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem, burned the city, murdered people in the streets, and destroyed the temple. Some Jewish people fled to Egypt, some stayed and suffered, and still others were forcibly exiled to Babylonia. This is not a theoretical mythology in biblical texts. This is not something that happened to some ancient people in a sanitized textbook that happens not to have pictures. These were real people, parents grieving their children, soldiers with blood on their hands, orphans crying, humans sold into slavery. This was an event that changed the future of the Jewish people, but really it changed all of us who have interacted with or branched off from that part of the world and from Judaism since. Since the 6th century before the Common Era, even when the Jewish people have had the opportunity to return to Zion, we've kept thriving in Jewish communities all over the world. It started with all over the world being from Egypt to Babylonia. In those days, the prophets were charged with giving hope to the people and encouraging a relationship with God as a great force bigger than us, caring about people healing from trauma and the future of humanity. The Babylonian exile ended when the kingdom of Persia conquered Babylonia. Still in the 6th century before the Common Era, King Cyrus invited the Jewish people to return to Zion. A majority, however, remained in Persia, although many did return to Jerusalem and some did rebuild. Many factors go into a decision about where I will live and whether or not I will move. To leave Persia would be to leave elderly parents or graves of loved ones, or to uproot children, or to lose business contacts, or to start over again in the land of my grandparents that perhaps I've never even seen. It makes sense that decades after the Babylonian exile, living in relative peace in Persia, that many people chose to stay put and live what they knew, even as the temple was rebuilt and Jewish life resumed in Zion. Around 600 years after that, in the year 70, the new conquerors of Zion were the Romans, who burned and destroyed the Second Temple. If you're not aware, that is, I'm sure, an authentic photograph of the Second Temple. It's a photograph of the model that's at the Israel Museum. The trauma that was inflicted by the destruction of the Second Temple, inflicted by the Romans, it was harsh and it was cruel. The Kotel, which is also known as the Western Wall, or sometimes referred to as the Wailing Wall, it was the western retaining wall of the temple in Jerusalem. This is the Kotel. It's a remnant of that time. So the diaspora spread, and it became clear that the Jewish people were not going to be gathered back anytime soon from the four corners of the earth. No temple, no sacrifices, no pilgrimages. How do we remain active in our relationship with God? How do we stay a unified people without a unifying place? The words of the prophets were for another time and place. They were in response in the 6th century before the Common Era, but now in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era, where the prophets had contextualized the Babylonian exile and that other return to Zion. Now in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, resilience and hope needed to look different because it was a different time and the circumstances also had changed. So our ancestors wrote down what is called the oral Torah. Instructions they taught were given to Moses alongside the written Torah at Mount Sinai. The oral Torah is known as the Mishnah, and by the year 200, Yehuda HaNasi oversaw it being written down. The idea was clear. In the absence of the sacrifices in the temple, the sacrificial system laid out in, for instance, the book of Leviticus, in the absence of that, we can study, learn, read, debate. We can create a diasporic Judaism. If the Babylonian exile hadn't ended us, surely the crushing oppression of the Roman Empire should have. But instead, by the year 550, we had the Babylonian Talmud, in a sense, an expansion of the Mishnah, that oral Torah, and inextricable from what Judaism has become today. Our will to remain a people with strong, deep roots gave us the fortitude to survive terrible conditions, to adapt and grow in new generations. Another time, I would love to show slides of all the incredible accomplishments and experiences and the positive moments of the Jewish people and our history. Then again, there are reasons why Dara Horn's book, The World Loves Dead Jews, is a bestseller. So on the one hand, the Jewish people thrived. For instance, on the Iberian Peninsula under Muslim rule, if we fast forward a bit from the time of the Talmud, we thrived on the Iberian Peninsula with poetry and art, in politics, in trade. It's referred to as the Golden Age of Spain. But by the time the Catholics ruled in the end of the 15th century, more communal trauma spread. During the Spanish Inquisition, Jewish people were given three choices: convert, leave, or die. This prompted the dispersion of Sephardic Jewry, that is Spanish Jewry or Jewry from the Iberian Peninsula, Sephardic Jewry spread across the globe, but particularly and including to South America, because of course this is during the end of the 15th and during the 16th century. Eventually, the first Jewish people to come to North America came in the 17th century up from Brazil, where they had lived under a rather cooperative, relatively lenient Dutch rule. However, in 1654, the Jews of Recife left because the Spanish-Portuguese Inquisition was finding its way to Brazil. So the first Jewish community to settle in New Amsterdam indirectly made their way to this continent because of the trauma. They certainly would have waved a magic wand to stop, but also their insistence that outside forces provide us with choices, difficult, painful choices, but choices nonetheless, even in times of horrible cruelty and hate. For those in Europe, the pogroms of the 19th and 20th centuries provided more difficult, painful choices. From 1881 to 1924, 2 million Jewish people immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe. After the Sephardic immigration to the United States, there was a period of immigration of German Jewry, and then from 1881 to 1924, in particular, Eastern European Jews. The influx ended in 1924 because of the Johnson-Reed Act, and the United States essentially saying no to any more immigrants. There were still people who wanted to come, of course, but the borders were closed to them. Perhaps we might imagine what would have been had millions of Ashkenazi Jews, that is, Jews of Eastern Europe, what would have been had they not fled Europe from 1881 to 1924 and had stayed put. But many of us also imagine what might have been had the United States continued to welcome immigrants. Embedded in this time frame of the late 19th and early 20th century is also the first Zionist Congress and Theodor Herzl laying out his dream in response to the anti-Semitism that he witnessed in France. So in France we had, and in Western Europe, the Enlightenment and emancipation. Emancipation meaning that laws that explicitly barred Jewish people from participation in civic life, in higher education, in all kinds of business. The Enlightenment led to emancipation, and it was a time of nationalism where the thought process was you could be French and you could also be Jewish. What Theodor Herzl, in his role as a journalist, witnessed was that while people were looking for belonging and safety and opportunity, in fact, anti-Semitism still was rampant in Europe. And Theodor Herzl's point was, if we are to be a nation and are not to be able to be both fully French, for instance, and Jewish, then the Jewish people treated as a nation need a nation. In 1939, the world population of Jewish people was 16.6 worldwide. So despite the Enlightenment and emancipation, there were responses to anti-Semitism, again, including the pogroms, but also including an attempt of at least some European Jews to leave. Trauma and creative growth. Would we forego the trauma if we could? Forego the loss of life, forego the utter destruction of entire families, communities, ways of life, forego the creativity that is born of trauma? I think most of us would say yes. Yes, we would give up the creativity and even the resilience if we could. But we can't. Jewish life, however, goes on today. About half, we would say, of the world Jewish population lives in Israel today, and close to half lives in the United States. These are 2019 statistics, but we usually say it's about a little bit more living in Israel than the United States today. Remembering that from the 17th to the 20th centuries, the patterns of immigration of Jewish people to North America. And it's not just that we continue to celebrate and to study and to grow, to build community and friendship and to learn Torah and nurture culture. It's that how we do these things today are different than they were in the past. They are different here in North America than they are in different countries. There's diversity even from Jewish life in New York to Oklahoma to California. Every community, every family all over the world, we have different stories and different customs, and yet we insist on being connected to each other. We insist that the timeline matters from Abraham and Sarah until us today. We insist our values matter and our ethics and our connections when something greater than ourselves. There are fundamental principles that we hold onto and we grow forward from them. So time and again, we have not been given the choice whether or not to stop the trauma. Our choices, as with all trauma, are in how we respond. The sun rises, the sun sets, the earth keeps going. Humanity has a legacy of resilience and adaptability in times of trauma, all humanity. I see it through the story of the Jewish people, but we can see it in many ways. And the interconnectivity of life on this planet means our stories overlap, and how we live them affects more than just ourselves. What if we were to think of the whole world as a construction site? Our essential activity in this construction site of the whole world is not just survival, or it's not just safety and maintenance. Our essential activity is hope, and it's visions of a better, safer world. And we are all construction workers. The refugees who left Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era, and in 70 of the Common Era, and those who fled Spain in 1492, and there were plenty of touchstone dates in between, and since there have been many more, those who came to this country, those who returned to Zion, and so many incredible stories in between. They had a belief that their lives had value and hope, and that their lives could be better. When we know our history in this world, we can see our trauma as a part of a long timeline. I don't mean to say a long timeline of suffering, although I used those examples. What I mean is a long timeline of change and adapting. Trauma is inevitable. In my faith tradition, the Garden of Eden, or the peace of the world to come, these are not promised to us in our mortal state here on earth. We can make the world better, we can partner with God, but we are not God. And the world will not be perfected until and unless we work for the day. We ask, how do we help and enable ourselves and those around us to breathe? And in the midst of trauma, it's not easy to take a breath. It's particularly difficult when others disregard our worth, our dignity, and our pain. Some of the history I presented was a long time ago, and yet it continues to shape us today. You have plenty of reading to do, I'm sure, if you really want to delve into the way that resilience can come out of communal trauma for those who are victims, but also for those who are perpetrators. Earlier this month, I brought a group of 18 people from my community here in Oklahoma City on a civil rights journey through Atlanta, Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham. We visited the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum. It's one powerful way to talk about the trauma in our nation born of slavery and greed and disrespect for the sanctity of human life. It was another perspective of history calling out for faith. Most of our religions unequivocally denounce injustice. As we all know, however, religion saying something is wrong does not stop people from perpetrating wrong. The long view of history begins with us being able to talk about our past, admit to our communal traumas, put voice to how we are not today in a time of perfect peace, and ask what to do to implement values-driven reconciliation. In Judaism, the values include taking responsibility when we cause others pain, repenting, pursuing justice, loving people who are like us, as well as loving people who are different, listening to other people's experiences as a sacred act, and believing deeply that God believes that we can create a better world, even if it's not perfected. I presented trauma from one perspective, a certain angle of the Jewish story. Maybe you're thinking about how trauma affects your life or your faith tradition. Maybe you could tell a story of resilience from a different perspective. Maybe you're thinking about people in your community who would benefit from a long view that reminds them about change that happens when we see that we have choices, and how resilience and progress do not grow from easy moments or ignoring the hard stuff, and how one person's individual trauma becomes an entirely different, manageable experience of resilience and adaptability when we recognize that an individual trauma is very likely a part of a communal problem. Some of us are privileged to feel pretty comfortable and stable and safe in our homes. Others are up at night worried about the state of the world. On the one hand, we may pray from our texts about the sanctity of the earth and all its creatures. On the other hand, we may notice that changes around us and wonder how we strayed so far from the garden. To take the long view of history through faith, we can ask ourselves, what are the promises of our faith traditions? Why do we adhere to the religions that we choose? As I mentioned earlier, Judaism, for instance, does not promise a magical, perfect peace in our mortal times. It promises we can get closer day by day with the choices we make in pursuing justice and pursuing mercy, in implementing the lessons of our sacred texts and our complicated history. As a rabbi, amongst other things, I am a purveyor of hope. My hope comes from seeing the thousands of years of ancestors before me who adapted to what was next and who enabled me to be here in this moment, touched by their persistence. Principles in Jewish life have included the importance of community, the opportunity for holiness in our lives, the amazing power of human beings to learn and do good and discover what's next. Our religious values are imbued with a belief that we can always do better, that God believes in us, and that we can repair what is broken in our world. So what is it that your faith promises? And also, what doesn't it promise? And in what ways do we see ourselves as purveyors of hope? You may believe in a God that gave us words from the heavens above us. I do. I also believe in the earth below our feet, and that earth below our feet grounds us. In between the heavens and the earth is us. The story of us is a story of resilience. We're here today because we have not given up. Whatever lens you would tell your story through, it's a lens of your ancestors who stuck it out, adapted, they changed in one way or another. Maybe you want to change away from the legacy that they passed on to you, but maybe you want to stand right in that stream and be sure that it keeps going. Communal trauma is not something any of us would choose, but how we respond to it can set the groundwork for creativity and growth. This does not mean trauma is good, and it doesn't mean that we are grateful for suffering. Rather, we might see that stories of resilience offer hope. These are not the changes or traumas that we would plan for. Sometimes we just need to get through today. When we remember that today is a part of a much grander, interconnected human story, we can get through it, and we will. In the expanse of what is yet to be, our faith values give us the structure to choose resilience, born of hope and experience. One day, our own times will be on a list of difficult years. Depending on how we live these times, they may also be part of a story that pivots toward the goodness that is yet to come, the goodness that we create with our hands and with our own hope. Thank you.
Oh, Rabbi Harris, thank you so much. We do have some questions. Each of them, I'm going to go ahead and put my camera on as well here. Each of them deserve a session all of their own. So we'll start with those as well. One of the questions from Stuart Ball is, I'm involved here in Canada with the Truth and Reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples. Do I understand correctly your presentation today could convey messages, lessons to address the communal trauma suffered by Indigenous peoples here?
I certainly hope so. You know, here in the US, we have those same issues. Well, we have also issues, I shouldn't say same, but we have also issues of really needing to be able to talk about the history that is fraught with hurting other people. There are ways that our nation today has benefited from the trauma and the pain of other people. It doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it okay, but to not discuss it is to have it shrouded in shame, because what we can't discuss, we can't face and we can't address. But yes, I happen to believe that being able to talk about the trauma, the pain, and the difficulties that people both inflict and suffer is really the only way to be able to begin a process of healing toward the future.
You know, that's an interesting question for those of us that are actually sitting in Oklahoma at this moment, where we received many on the Trail of Tears. So that's a very interesting question, Stuart Ball. Another question or a comment from Lily Freeman, who says, the late Barbara Johnson said that pain is inevitable, but misery is optional. It is about allowing creativity to heal and provide hope. We have more questions popping up. Wonderful. We have a question here from Jim Siegrun. This one deserves a full session itself. What is the activity of our speakers' understanding of the promised Messianic Age in healing and actively building the future vision?
Sure, I appreciate that. Thank you. So the promised Messianic age in Jewish thought is actually, there's not one answer to that. So you asked for mine. I believe that we have within our power the ability to make tomorrow better than today. Tomorrow is the world to come. And if tomorrow is better than today, then we are moving ourselves toward the world to come. I do not believe that there will be an individual who eternally is able to rule over the entire world in a way that brings about peace in some of the ways that are talked about, or at least understood in some of the biblical texts. That's how I approach it. I do believe in a perfect peace, but I believe that the perfect peace it is something that we experience after life and not during.
Thank you so much for that. My guess is there's probably there are a lot of good resources to answer that question as well from the Jewish tradition.
There are, yeah.
I think this is a follow-up question here related to probably the question about the Indigenous persons in Canada. Chris Haig says, this is exactly what the moderator of the United Church of Canada is saying. We are no longer to keep silent, which I think was a follow-up comment.
Yes, and for those, I understand that that's also particularly in regards to Indigenous peoples. I also would put for those of us here in the United States, African Americans, into that thought process as well, because we've done a really lousy job of educating about slavery, about how this country was physically built, the commerce around it, and by ignoring it, we don't do ourselves any favors in terms of progress.
We have a couple of more questions here. Well, someone was asking to restate the last question. I think that was related to the Messianic age, quite likely.
Yeah, the Messianic age piece, I really appreciate that question, because I think that there are a lot of times when we're in situations as people who are Jewish and people who are Christian that we hear the phrase Judeo-Christian. And my experience with the phrase Judeo-Christian is that it often refers to a Christian understanding of Judaism as opposed to a Jewish understanding of Judaism. And there are many things, Messianism being one of them, that are rather diverse in terms of contemporary Jewish thought and along the spectrum of individual belief and scholarship that if we were only a biblical religion, Judaism today, we would probably have a different take on it. But because, as I mentioned, we have the Mishnah, the Talmud, the commentaries, we have Enlightenment literature, post-emancipation literature, we've got such an array of things that in many ways are considered holy text for many people within the Jewish community, that understanding that there's this really large expanse that starts with Hebrew scriptures but doesn't end there, builds up the idea of what might Messianism be. And 19th century Judaism also really expanded on that in particular.
Thank you so much for that. You might also mention, you talk about the diversity of thought. Within Judaism itself, there is a continuum, as there is with many faith traditions. There is a continuum of belief systems as well. You're from the Reformed tradition, and there are other traditions as well within Judaism.
Absolutely, right.
We have a question here. Ellie Wiesel said, hope by faith. Do you agree? And your thoughts on the Palestinian issue?
Hope by faith? I didn't hear.
Hope by faith.
So those are two big questions. You know, hope is a choice. But I also think that faith is a choice, asking ourselves what we want to put our faith in. I don't think that hope is wishful thinking, but I also don't think that faith is wishful thinking. In terms of there are many Palestinian issues and Israeli-Palestinian issues. There's not just one issue there. I highly recommend that people read Daniel Gordis's book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. I don't think that anybody can, in the 21st or in 2022, I don't think that you can have an intelligent conversation about Israel without having read Gordis's book, to be very honest. And I would have to know more about what issue you're asking about. So Mary knows, although those on the call don't. I've led 2 interfaith trips to Israel and the Palestinian territories with Muslims, Christians, and Jews. What they're called dual narrative trips, where we have one guide that is Israeli and of Jewish descent, and we have one guide who is Palestinian and of Muslim descent, which in both cases, the Jew and the Muslim, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are religiously observant. And we've had really deep conversations about what that land means to different people, the history of the land, where we consider the integrity of leadership of the land to come from. And I would also note that it's a very difficult piece of politics that ought not be framed, it really shouldn't be framed in terms of faith. In my opinion, it's not about Jews and Muslims, and it's not even necessarily about Israelis and Palestinians, although it is, but it's also about the United States having a presence in the Middle East. It's also about Russia and Russia's relationship with Syria, amongst other places. It's a very complicated situation that's not just about 1948 or 67 or 73.
Yeah, and I can attest to the fact that whenever Barrett and I have had this conversation, she usually starts, even in casual conversations that we wonderfully have from time to time, she usually starts with 2 words. It's complicated, because it is not a simple thing to discuss. But again, deserving perhaps not only a session on its own, but a whole trip with people to discuss as well.
Sure. Imam and Chassi and I can come together and have one of our conversations, right? I mean, you're talking about vast cultural differences. You're talking about Jewish people kicked out of their homes and their wealth stolen from them to be sent to Israel, where, you know, sometimes you'll hear people say things like, well, they should go back to Europe. They didn't come from Europe. Like, what? They should go, you're saying they should go back to Iran? It's so complicated.
It is complicated. We have a question here requesting that you repeat the title and the author of the book that you mentioned.
Oh, yes, sure. The author is Daniel Gordis, G-O-R, D as in David, I, S as in Sam. The book is called Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. I want to say that it's from 2019, I think.
Yeah,
No,
I think we can put
that. No, it's before that. It's before that. It's earlier than that.
If we can find an online link, we'll put it on the resource page as well. Okay, so the questions are really starting to increase here. We have a statement here, your observation that we must talk about trauma in order to process its truth and be able to grow from it is the opposite of those who are opposed to the critical race theory, who say talking about the trauma is divisive and unhelpful. How would you see this divide ever being bridged? Thank you, Ruth Hainsworth.
Yeah, I mean, putting the title of critical race theory aside, because of course, that's not even what we would be teaching in our schools anyway. We're just talking about teaching basic history and the economics of slavery and the South and the North, for that matter, as well. I would challenge anybody who has experienced trauma, personal trauma, just personal trauma, a physical attack, an unexpected traumatic death of a loved one, a terrible car accident, I mean, fill in the blank, soldiers who return from war. How do we help people to heal from trauma? And we've learned that helping individuals heal from trauma won't work if we say to them, oh, don't talk about it. Oh my goodness, you lost an infant during childbirth. Don't talk about it. Don't say that baby's name. Just push it aside and everything's going to be fine. That does not help us to heal. That does not help us to find peace in our hearts or to move forward. If on an individual level that is the case, then I would propose that on a national level, how much the more so. And P.S., that does relate to the question about Israelis and Palestinians. In no way would I say that the topics, so much more has been coming out in the last 10 years or so about the ways that Palestinian villages were destroyed in 1948, in ways that my father, who was in the IDF, he was an officer in the IDF in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in ways that when he was being educated in military school, they didn't tell them about that. They hid what was done. And talking about communal trauma is just as important as talking about personal trauma. And knowing that when we talk about our personal trauma, it helps us to build connections with each other, right? When I open up to a friend and I have some vulnerability with that friend, and even if I have done something that that friend finds despicable, if we're able to listen to each other and have sacred listening over it and say, oh, you're suffering, let's talk about that. If on an individual level, I know that that's the only way to build relationships, vulnerability, bridges, and peace. I mean, on a communal level, it's scary, vulnerable, dangerous, all the things, but it's also how we work toward that better world to come, that tomorrow that could be better.
It brings me back to that initial question about the truth and reconciliation process. What you're talking about there. Would love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, look, Germany, there's some really interesting stuff that you can see. There's documentaries and all kinds of stuff that you can find about the way that Germany has dealt with what they did during the Holocaust. Portugal, I mentioned the Spanish Inquisition and the Iberian Peninsula from the 15th century. If a Jewish person can show that their ancestry comes from Portugal and that they were forced out during the Inquisition, they can get Portuguese citizenship today. I mean, there are ways to talk about what we did wasn't right, and we can't take it away, but we can take responsibility and be accountable. And I can't, from a Jewish perspective, sins between people to people, God can't atone for those sins. The only way that I can make amends for what I do to hurt another person is by going to that person. And then I can go to God.
It's really powerful. Oh, my goodness. So many good questions here. What are your thoughts on the idea of struggling and wrestling with God in light of trauma? And what are your thoughts on the Psalms of Lament in working through the struggles of traumatic situations?
So I would imagine, since this is an educated group, you know that the word Yisrael, Jacob's name, was changed, and he was given the name Yisrael after wrestling with the angel, and that the text tells us, for you have struggled or you have wrestled with beings divine and you have prevailed. I think that it's very much, it's a thing, right? Struggling with God and wrestling with God and trying to figure out the God that I do and the God that I don't believe in, and my relationship with that God and what I think whether God's limits or God's chosen limits over humanity. And God, why have you chosen to limit yourself over humanity? And because you've chosen to limit yourself, what is it that I have to do? And I don't want to do that, man. That's hard stuff sometimes. And the idea that we can ignore our callings, but the callings aren't going to go away. So that becomes our choice as to whether or not we want to, how much we want to struggle with God versus how much we want to accept that we are divinely called to be at least better today than we were yesterday. In terms of Psalms of Lament, I am just a huge proponent for folks finding what speaks to their hearts. And that can include obviously Psalms, and it can, I have personally a favorite meditation teacher from the Jewish perspective. Her name is Yael Levy. She's a rabbi, Yael Levy, and she has a website, The Way In. I think that's what it's called, The Way In. And she sends out weekly meditations that I think that many of you would recognize as Psalm-esque in terms of calling out to God and asking where I am in this moment and how I can be responsive. So big fan of finding what works for us.
I have a feeling I'll be putting more links on the resource page, just so that you all know. Oftentimes, whenever I am struggling with the issue of lament, one of the healing persons in my life is to talk to Rabbi Harris, just because she has such a perspective on that. My goodness, more questions.
I think it's actually it's A Way In, not the awayin.org.
We'll try to put that on the resource page as well. My goodness, we have, let's see, other questions. I'm having trouble reading those. Okay, I see a lot of trauma being inflicted in the US and elsewhere by those embedded in earthly powers and principalities that in some cases, which seem to be increasing, cannot be addressed without violating civil law. I'm not afraid of violating such laws, but I wonder if it's possible to prevent or at least bring a stop to the inflicting of trauma in order to try to heal it now instead of a generation or 3 from now. Your thoughts? I think that has to do with perhaps civil disobedience. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and also I think the long view of history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I certainly understand the desire to say, I don't want to wait 3 generations. But I don't know how many of you were pulled away from the Senate hearings this morning to join us, but I was thinking about how 3 generations ago, it would not have been a dream to have Judge Jackson sitting before the Senate committee today. I mean, that wouldn't have,
No.
that wouldn't have even, right? So on the one hand, I understand, I don't want to wait. I see the difference. So this is my 22nd year in the rabbinate, something like that. I was ordained in 2000. And I see the difference between, and this year is the 50th anniversary of women being ordained in North America. And I see the difference between my generation of female rabbis and those who are newly ordained, and things that my generation put up with. Whew, the women coming out today, they're not gonna stand for that. But it didn't happen overnight. So yeah, okay, it's only 20 some years. I get that. That's not very long. But what Sally Priesand or what the Regina Jonas, who is the first woman that we know of ordained as a rabbi in Berlin, before the war, and she served actually alongside Viktor Frankl in the concentration camps, and she died. I mean, she was killed in the Holocaust. I don't know what she went through, but I do know it's radically different than what I go through. I think that there's just a piece of patience. I mean, if the laws aren't going to do what we need, we live in a civil society where we need to change those laws. And we have changed them. We've changed them dramatically. The right to vote. Is it frustrating that it can't happen in my lifetime, the changes that I want to see happen? It sure is. But no, there's that whole story about Honey, the circle maker who comes across a man, an old man why it's always men. That's a whole thing that we can talk about, right? Why are all the great stories all about men? Anyway, he comes across an old man who's planting a carob tree, and he laughs at him and he says, "You're never going to get any carob off of this tree. What are you doing planting this tree?" And he says, "No, my ancestors planted for me. And so I have carob because of them. So I plant for those who are going to come after me." That's what eternality is to me.
Thank you. Wow. A couple of more questions that are here as well. Does your view of the sovereignty of God include a divine plan that will ultimately be fulfilled for Israel because it is the will of God? Another.
No.
Okay. All right.
No.
You want to expand upon that answer?
So you mentioned Reform Judaism in particular, which is grew out of the 19th century, grew out of Enlightenment. And one of the things that really modern Judaism focuses on is the idea that we have responsibility. We are partners with God, and what we do matters. And God has basically given us a blueprint for how to make the world better, and it is constantly changing or being added on to, right? That's the idea of, it's not just, for instance, the 5 books of Moses. On top of the 5 books of Moses, you then have the prophets and the writings. So that's later text. And then on top of the prophets and writings, you then have Mishnah, you then have Midrash, you then have, so it's constantly growing and constantly changing and expanding and responding to contemporary times. So on the one hand, we have a blueprint. On the other hand, we're constantly building this world. And there's a lovely song that Menachem Creditor wrote based on text that basically says that I'll build this world from love, you'll build this world from love, and if we do our part, then God will build this world from love. But we're partners, and I also don't believe in the idea that the Jewish people are chosen in some way by God to be in some human hierarchy over others. I think that we've been given a particular task, but it's a parallel task to other peoples in the world.
Thank you. We have a reference here to Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. That might be good to include in the resources as well. Keith Shaden has said that. And a comment here about what our faith promises related to tribulation, but be of good cheer.
I'm sorry, in relation to
tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. So my faith promises a relationship with the one who has overcome tribulation, and with faith, family, and to live in that spirit with those I am gifted to meet, friend and foe alike, he says.
And I love that, because as something that this is what my faith promises me, then we're able to say, therefore, there's a purpose to the tribulation. And I don't necessarily have to believe that within my faith tradition, but that's the incredible beauty of multiple faith traditions and people who have no faith, who find meaning and purpose through the ways that they interact with the world and with others. And just that idea of, what does my faith promise and why am I choosing, because each of us chooses it every day, Why am I choosing for this to be the message that I take from the universe and that I pass along to others? How will this message be the promise that the world needs today, or one of the promises?
Well, with that wonderful word, we are at the top of the hour. I know if you all were on camera, you would be applauding right now to say thank you to Vered Harris, Rabbi Harris, for being here today. So thank you so, so much for your good wisdom and good insights during these difficult times. I know that you all are especially thankful for the extra time we've had today to have some more conversation. Even though we couldn't hear you, many of you placed really great comments and questions in the question box. So I want to invite you next week as well to hear the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson. She is the Associate General Minister, Wider Church Ministries and Operations Co-Executive for the Global Ministries for the United Church of Christ, and she'll be talking with us about increasing our racial justice IQ. I know you don't want to miss that as well. So watch your emails, go to the webinar hub. Some said that that's not, the resource page may not be as visible on the mobile version. You may have to look on your desktop or your laptop to be able to get all those resources. But we do invite you to go to the webinar hub, and we'll put some of these resources there as well. Thank you for being here. Vered, thank you again. Rabbi Harris, thank you so much for your presence and your time with us today and your wonderful wisdom. Blessings to you all. Thank you. Be safe.